How's your climate summit going? Awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. Come on in, grab those seats. I hope you've been to some fantastic sessions today. I know I have been blown away by our speakers today. Let's give all of our speakers a little round. Yeah. And I know you all brought those actions to do. I've never seen so many petition signatures happening today at tabling, all of the actions. All of you tablers, thank you so much for bringing those things. Yeah. So just one quick program note. He is very multi-talented, but no, Bill is not going to play the drums. At least I'm pretty sure he's not going to. That is set up because I hope you'll stay with us after our keynote speaker this afternoon to enjoy some punch and cookies, a little light reception, and then we are going to be honored by the music of cultural hip-hop artist Nikki Love Rhodes. They're going to rock it out, you guys, so please, I know everybody did long drives and many things to get here today, but you don't want to miss this final performance act tonight. We will take some questions if we have time. Where are my question runners? I got a couple folks right down here. Make yourselves known. So the way that we'll do that, thank you so much, you guys. The volunteers today, what? So the way they will do that is they'll each kind of take a side. They've got note cards and they've got pens, and if you raise your hand, they will bring one of those cards to you, and then they'll bring them to me, and then I'll bring them to Bill. It's a classic assembly line process we're going to do today. So make sure handwriting is something even I can read, though. That'd be great. And I'm not sure, I think everybody's heard of our final speaker here. He was gracious enough to come walk around the tables and talk with many of you, and I think took about 100 selfies just now, which was very, very nice of him. I know he's the reason so many of us are doing this work today and inspiring us to continue it. I know he's played a big role in my own advocacy and understanding of the climate movement. And I often tell this story, but I'm going to tell it again. When I was at Western Michigan University, my colleagues are here from Kalamazoo, woot woot. Yeah. Our climate change working group brought Bill McKibben there in the fall of 2013, and we started to kick off one of the most amazing series of events. I was an academic, it was 2013, no one said climate out loud. I was a political scientist. Almost all of my research was about how do we talk to climate deniers? How do we make those conversations happen? How do we convince them? And so I remember standing up at Bill's lecture there in 2013 and asking this very long-winded academic question, as we do. And his answer after my very long, well-cited question, maybe comment, was simply, "You don't." And then he kept speaking. And I was crushed at the moment, shocked. What's he mean you don't talk to the climate deniers? I know you've all seen the Yale communications and talked to the Climate Stick and the Citizens Climate Lobby folks who will tell you, of course, as we started today, that that's because over 70% of Michiganders know climate change is happening and over 66% are concerned. The number of deniers hasn't really changed in all that time, from 7 to 11%. And his answer was spot on, of course. Why would I spend my time talking to 10% who's never gonna listen or agree? Why wouldn't I spend my time instead galvanizing the over 70% of you that do know what's happening? Right. That's what the Michigan Climate Action Network is all about. Today's program was really especially crafted to amplify the work of the grassroots climate advocates from across the state, to connect all of you with each other so that we can really feel, again, like we are the majority and start acting like it. That's right. Your advocacy and collective action is what makes democracy work. And so I know that he'll give us some more words of wisdom tonight, and he knows the best ways for us to take the most effective climate action. One of the most influential thinkers of any time, educator, author, founder of the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org. He's recently helped found Third Act, who's here today. Organizes people over the age of 60 for action on climate and justice. Please help me welcome to the stage the incomparable Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you all. That was a very kind introduction, and what a pleasure. What a fantastic pleasure. It really, it was such a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm in the middle of this long, leading up to Election Day, just out everywhere that I can. And so I'm a little worn out. And to walk just through those tents over there and see all the work that people were doing from all across the state, from Ann Arbor, but from Detroit and from Pontiac and from Kalamazoo and from Grand Rapids, and I bet there were some people from Traverse City there somewhere, and on and on and on. I wrote the first book about this, what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect, back in 1989. So I was in my 20s then, and I'm in my 60s now, so I've spent my whole life thinking about this thing. And at the beginning, one of the hardest parts of it was that nobody else was thinking about it. And it felt like you were, for a while, that kind of nightmare you have when you can tell that something bad's happening, but you can't get anyone else to turn around and look at the large monster that's pursuing you down. That's what it felt like for a while. And that may have been one of the reasons that at a certain point I just started to organize things so that there'd be other people I could, but man, just to be out there today and just see the breadth and depth and skill and power that people are bringing to all of this, it just moves me almost to tears. I am so grateful. And now I'm going to repay you by bumming you out for a little while. I'll try to get, and I will get, to a better place because there are good things we can talk about. But I think the moment just calls for a kind of assessment of where we are, where we stand. And where we stand right now is finally absolutely in the middle of this climate fight. Beginning about January of last year, 2023, I started getting calls first from oceanographer friends of mine, and they were saying, pay some attention. Something's happening with the temperature of the oceans. Obviously, it's been going steadily up for several decades now, but they were starting to spike very dramatically. And that spike was so sharp that by June of last year, 2023, the temperature readings that we were getting on buoys off the Florida Keys were the hottest temperatures ever measured in the world's oceans. 101 degrees, which is basically what you turn your hot tub to, okay? By June of last year, 2023, that heat had moved onshore. The hottest days in the year on this planet, we can globally average the temperature of the planet now every day. We can get a temperature reading because there's enough satellites and buoys and weather stations. And we know that the hottest days always come in the few weeks around the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere because there's so much more land mass to attract heat in the northern hemisphere. Anyway, those temperatures around the solstice in 2023, the scientists were telling us were not only off the charts, they were off the wall the charts were tacked to. They were the highest temperatures we've ever recorded on this planet. The records go back about 200 years, because that's how long we've had thermometers, really. But scientists are good at finding proxy records, ocean sediments, glacial cores, things like that. And they were saying quite confidently that those days were the hottest that we have had on this planet in the last 125,000 years at least. 125,000 years ago is when the anthropologists tell us that people started etching symbols on bones, you know. In other words, you're living on a hotter planet than humans have ever lived on. And since last June, every month has broken the monthly record for the hottest month. And we've smashed those records already for the hottest days ever recorded on this earth. And the consequences have been exactly 100% what every scientist was warning about a very long time ago, and we've watched come true. I mean, the North Pole and the South Pole are melting at extraordinary pace. The data out of the Antarctic about the ways that the biggest glaciers on Earth are being undercut by warm seawater curls your hair if you keep up with it. The great ocean currents of the Atlantic seem now to be flickering and faltering as a surge of fresh water from the Arctic melt begins to dilute the North Atlantic, with consequences so large it's hard even to describe. We have data from the last few weeks about the Amazon, one of the other 3 or 4 truly huge physical features on our planet. It's now moving into a condition of drought, this rainforest, and the incredible and beautiful transport of water through that vast rainforest is broken down, and large parts of it are starting to turn to savanna. On a day-to-day basis, the things that we see the most are probably related to hydrology, to the way that water moves around our Earth. If you wanted one fact to understand our time on Earth, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold, okay? Which means that in arid areas we get more evaporation and then more drought, and then eventually things catch on fire. Those fires in Canada last year produced vast amounts of carbon. They made last year Canada, which is only 20 million, 30 million people, into the 5th largest carbon producing country on Earth, right up there next to China and India and the United States. That's a feedback loop of the kind that we've long feared. Once that water is up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down. And so now we see rainstorms of unprecedented size over and over and over again. If you go on TikTok or something on any given day, there's a whole just genre of films of cars washing down the main streets of mountain towns in one corner of the world or another, because it's always now flooding. Some places, we sit here this afternoon, one of the biggest hurricanes, largest extent hurricanes we've ever measured is spinning in the Gulf. It's going over hotter water in the Gulf of Mexico than there's ever been there before. It's forecast to produce the largest storm surge we've ever seen along the area from Tampa north through the Big Bend. They're predicting record rain, breaking all the rainfall records for cities like Atlanta as that Hurricane Helene moves inland over the next 48 hours. So let's keep people very much in mind who are dealing with the trauma, some of them, of losing everything that they've spent their lives building. And if you think it's bad here, well, my home state of Vermont's had the worst flooding we've ever had the last few years, and it's been terrible, but we have enough money still that we can do some rebuilding and so on and so forth. When you get to much of the rest of the world, that's just not the case. Last summer, when the rains finally stopped in Vermont and we began the long, tedious work of, draining basements and so on and so forth, the rain started in North Africa. And they had the biggest rainstorms they've ever had in their history. And the biggest, most intense rainfall was in Libya. It managed in one river to wipe out 2 dams in a row, the rush of that water, and then it poured into a coastal city where it swept 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in an hour. That kind of biblical devastation now happens pretty routinely and in places that have done literally nothing to cause the problem that they now suffer from. The entire continent of Africa has put 3% of all the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that are up there. That's it. The United States, which has 3% of the world's people, has put about 25% of all the greenhouse gases into the air, and it's all still up there. The stuff that came out of the tailpipe of my family's maroon Plymouth Fury in 1974 when I was getting my learner's permit in the suburbs is still up there in the air trapping heat, okay? We've raised the temperature 1.5 degrees Celsius so far, so 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. That's caused the complete devastation that we've seen. The scary part is we're still in the early stages of this, and we're on a trajectory right now that if we don't interrupt it quickly, we'll raise the temperature about 3 degrees Celsius by the time the youngest people in this room are my age. And if that happens, I think by this point it's becoming pretty clear that we just will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to. That's more violent chaos and flux than we can deal with. The UN estimates that it would produce somewhere between 1 billion and 3 billion climate refugees. So at a rough count, 1 person in 4 on this world having to get up and leave their home and go somewhere else. 1 million refugees arriving on our southern border was enough to completely discombobulate our politics and bring out the ugliest possible set of things you can imagine, which we're now seeing play out in grotesque form in our presidential election. Imagine multiplying that by 1,000 as 1 billion people move around the world. Even before you get to questions around what you can grow and how disease will spread and on and on and on. The most important job humans have ever had is not to stop global warming. It's too late for that. To stop it short of the place where it cuts civilization off at the knees. That's what we're talking about. And here's the real kicker. If we're going to do it, we have to do it fast. Otherwise, it doesn't count. We're very used to political problems, issues that stay around forever, As long as I've been alive, we've been discussing in this country whether or not we should have national health insurance. I think we very much should. I think it's a sin that we don't. I think people die and go bankrupt every year. I assume that eventually we will decide to do what every other industrialized country does and guarantee health care as a matter of right. But it won't make it harder to do it because we delayed. It won't add some set of obstacles because we didn't do it in the past. Climate change isn't like that. Once you've melted the Arctic, nobody has a program for how you're going to freeze it back up again. And so the need to move with extraordinary speed was underlined a couple of years ago by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which gave us the best set of numbers and deadlines possible. They said, we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 to have some hope of staying on that rough pathway that we set out in Paris in those climate talks some years ago. 2030, by my watch, is 5 years and 4 months away. That does not give us much time to do what needs to be done. Among other things, it throws into relief precisely how important this November's election is, because the president after this one will take office in January of 2029, okay? This is the last one that's going to count in those ways. So that's the difficult hole that we are in right now. And it's symbolized by that big storm churning in the Gulf of Mexico right now, as if a kind of just constant reminder of where we are and what the stakes are. They could not be higher. This is the biggest thing that humans have ever done, and by a large margin. All right. We're through the bad part. I take a breath, you take a breath, then we will figure out what we're going to do. And in fact, this part of it is much easier to talk about than it was even a few years ago, because we really know what we need to do now. It's in much clearer relief all the time. I mean, the problem here, 85 or 90% of the problem, is burning coal and gas and oil. That's what's triggered this crisis. And so the only way to stop it is to stop burning coal and gas and oil. For us to do that in 5 years requires, I think, that we find something else to power our lives more or less as they are, even as we begin the long-term task of shifting how we live. That's not going to happen in huge ways in the course of a few years. We're still going to be mostly living where we live and largely driving what we drive and so on and so forth, considered as a mass. In fact, much of the world is still coming into the into the realm of consuming things and whatever. So, the one gift we really have is the one that's been given to us by the engineers over the last decades. They've been guided by good policy and lots of advocacy and movement, but they've managed to drop the price of renewable energy 90% in the last decade. That's the one new huge fact on the ground, and it could not be more important. Sometime 3 or 4 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce power from the sun and the wind than from burning things. And that was an amazing moment in the human story. It's the way that to think about it is, you now inhabit a planet where the cheapest way to make energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun, okay? That is a water into wine miracle that, if embraced with absolute fervor and conviction, could get us a lot of the place that we need to go. I don't think it's completely sunk in, even among people who really are deeply involved in this work. I think even among us, there's still a tendency to think about the sun and wind as alternative energy, as if it was the sort of Whole Foods of energy. But it's not. It is the Costco of energy now, okay? It is the cheap stuff available in bulk if we set our minds to doing it, if we get it right. And I'm going to tell you 2 stories that I hope hearten you as much as they hearten me. This is stuff I've been reporting on in the last couple of weeks, so it's fresh information. First, stories about California, And California has done a better job than any place else in building out solar panels and things, any place in this country anyway. The Chinese have done more of it than anybody else. But in this country, California's been quite aggressively putting up solar panels and, crucially, putting batteries on their grid. And at some point in the last year, it crossed some kind of tipping point where it became super visible. For the last 100 days, California has produced more than 100% of the power that it's used for long stretches of each day from renewable energy, okay? Which is brand new. It means that at night, when the sun goes down, the biggest source of supply to the grid in California is now batteries that have been soaking up the sun all day. And there weren't any batteries on their grid 3 or 4 years ago. This is brand new, but it's beautiful. And here's the number that drives it home. And it comes from my friend Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who's the great renewable energy researcher in this country. Last year to this year, the amount of natural gas burned in California to generate electricity has dropped 29% in 1 year. In the fifth biggest economy in the world, and arguably the most modern economy in the world. That is a staggering number. That number is finally big enough to start taking some bite out of that 3 degrees Celsius sort of shadow that hangs over us. Were that replicated quickly in a lot of other places, and it could be right now, Texas has taken the lead and is installing this stuff more aggressively than California. So those kind of numbers will be true next year, I think, in Texas. But here's the other story I want to tell you, because I think it's even more interesting and beautiful. And it starts in Pakistan, which is a country that's taken it harder on the chin from climate change, by the way, than maybe any place else on Earth. I mean, the floods in Pakistan twice in the last decade have been the largest floods since Noah. I mean, a third of the country covered with water, tens of millions of people displaced. At any rate, the beginning of this year, people started noticing that demand for electricity in Pakistan from the national grid had dropped about 10%, which normally only happens in a very deep recession or something like COVID, okay? And people were scratching their heads trying to figure out what was going on because the economy seemed still to be growing in Pakistan. And as people tried to figure out what was happening, one of the places they turned was to Google Earth. And they started looking at images from Karachi and Lahore and Islamabad and wherever. And what they were seeing was a sudden explosion in solar panels just going up on roofs of everything. It had nothing to do with government policy. Nobody was subsidizing it. It was just there were so many cheap Chinese solar panels now available that people were just buying them left and right because they wanted that cheap power. In the last 6 months, Pakistanis have put up on their roofs by themselves the equivalent of 30% of the nation's electric grid. Okay? That's another number on of the scale that matters. And I've interviewed people across Africa saying that the same thing was happening there in South Africa and Eswatini and Lesotho and Mozambique and Madagascar. They were seeing these same kind of numbers. What this means to me is that we are at the moment when it is possible to imagine that human beings could very quickly bring to an end our venerable habit of setting things on fire. For 700,000 years, we've set things on fire. The archaeologists figure out the earliest humans by finding campfire rings, with charcoal in them. Darwin said that language and fire were the two things that set us apart. It's done us good. I mean, we learned to cook food. That gave us the big brain. We could move north and south from the equator. Nobody was living in Ann Arbor before there was fire, The anthropologists even think that the social bonds that mark our species were in large measure built by endless nights just standing around the campfire, the kind of proto-Zoom, that of an earlier age. And then when we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil, we called that the Industrial Revolution, and it produced modernity, pretty much everything around us that we know. So combustion's been okay, but now the cost is too high. The destruction of the planet's climate system, not to mention the fact that 1 death in 5 on this planet comes from breathing the particulates that are spewed into the air when you burn coal and gas and oil. 9 million of our brothers and sisters on this planet every year die that way. So the chance to move past it is incredibly beautiful. I should confess that I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I like the idea that the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away that we now know how to make full use of. We catch its rays on those panels. We take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the wind that spins those windmills. That's an amazing vision, I think, of a planet that in short order moved past combustion. An amazing vision for us, but, and here's the rub, us isn't quite everybody. There's a small group of people on this planet who own gas fields and coal mines and oil wells, and to them, those are the scariest possible numbers. Why do you think big oil is pouring ungodly amounts, unprecedented amounts of money into the Trump campaign this year? It's because gas, California used 29% less natural gas this year. They can read the writing on the wall, and they want to slow down that transition as much as they can, because every day that it progresses means that their huge reserves of oil and gas are worth less. And they're, at present value, they're worth, in this country, 25 or 30 trillion dollars. That's why there are people who have spent decades doing climate denial and disinformation and everything else. That's why they've purchased political parties and politicians. That's the battle here. Are we going to realize the dreams of a small group of people for trillions of dollars from digging up hydrocarbons? Or are we going to realize the dreams of a planet that could be producing its own power because the sun and the wind are everywhere? It's not that this is without complication. We have to go mine some stuff to do this, but the amount that we have to mine is extraordinarily small compared to what we do now. If you think about it for even a second, you'll figure out why. You go mine some lithium and you put it in a battery and it lasts there for 25 years, and now we can recycle that, and we are recycling it. If you go mine some coal, what do you do with it? You set it on fire, and then you have to go mine some more tomorrow. Here's a statistic that sticks in my head. 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is just carrying coal and oil and gas back and forth around the planet to be burned, which is now unnecessary because the sun is happy to make its voyage across the sky every day because the wind moves every day. So that's what the fight is now. It shouldn't be a fight. On a logical, rational world, we would take the fact that we have the deepest problem we've ever come up against, and we have a good, workable solution, and we would just get to it. And people are trying, That's been this big, complicated, sprawling process that we've all been working on. But we don't live in a logical enough world, and that's why we have to build movements to try and force the pace of it. Every time I end up in jail, I find myself thinking, this is dumb. why am I here, in handcuffs, trying to convince our leaders to take physics seriously? This seems stupid. But sometimes that's precisely what's required. And so I'm going to end here by talking just about the organizing that we need to do and that we've done. And I want to begin it, since we're at the university, by paying particular tribute to the young people who've done most of the work on it, okay? When I started 350.org, it was with 7 college students, and they were fantastic. And pretty soon, with beginner's luck, we really had no idea what we were doing. There were 7 students, there were 7 continents, each one took one. The one that took the Antarctic was also responsible for the internet, okay? But with beginner's luck, within a couple of years, we'd organized, the first big kind of global demonstrations about climate change, 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. And we've gone on to organize demonstrations everywhere on Earth except North Korea now. We helped, and with many people in this room, start the fight against the Keystone Pipeline, a fight that we won and a fight that we very much hope presages victory in the fight over Line 5 here in Michigan. It's been a real honor to get to be a tiny part of that fight from the start and just to get to watch people do it really well. We also started this big fossil fuel divestment campaign that this university joined into eventually with great leadership from students here. That's become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel now. But the biggest benefit of that turned out to be the students who did that work on so many college campuses, because they learned a lot, and when they graduated, they kept going. When they got out, they founded something called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal was what eventually, once it had gone through the congressional sausage-making machinery and been lovingly manipulated by Joe Manchin and all, that's what eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act and our first effort at and if young people hadn't done that work, it would not have happened. That's what built the political momentum that made that possible. And of course, there were lots of other young people all around the world. You all know Greta Thunberg, and you should. And she's one of my favorite people to work with on the planet. I had the fun of last summer writing her a long letter to congratulate her on her graduation from high school. Think about that for a minute. She'd be the first to say there are 10,000 Gretas around the world, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on school strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit, This is as it should be, because young people are the ones who are most at risk here. I'm going to be dead before the absolute worst of this happens, but if you're in college now, if we don't get this under control, it doesn't really matter what career you're training for. Your career will be disaster response, because that will be everybody's career. That's what we'll do until we run out of the ability to do it. So it makes sense that they've been in the lead. But the point I want to make is, I began to hear a few too many people my age say, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem. And if they really wanted to add insult to injury, sometimes they would look at a young person and say, you give me hope. That's not okay. Not okay to take the most difficult problem the world has ever encountered and just sort of assign it to people to do, in between algebra homework and field hockey practice, Which is why I started casting around for, young people, for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, lack the structural power to by themselves make the change we need on the scale that's required in the time we still have. Greta may be Prime Minister of Sweden someday, but it's not going to be in the next 5 years, So I started casting about for who has structural power, and the conclusion I came to was that if you've reached the age where you have hair coming out your ears, you probably have structural power coming out your ears too, There are 70 million of us over the age of 60 in this country. That's a lot. We punch way above our weight because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? And we ended up with most of the assets. We've got most of the money. So if you wanted to push around the state legislature or the federal government or Wall Street, and I would like to push around them all, it helps to have some people with hairlines like mine. So we started this thing, Third Act, and so much fun to see our group here who are representative of the now about 100,000 people in 2 years who have surged into this thing across the country and formed fantastic working groups that are doing amazing things, that are taking on the public utility commissions, that are figuring out how to lobby. I mean, look, one of the dirty secrets of American politics is there's so much apathy that if you get a group of 300 or 400 people who are committed to doing something, they become a serious player right away. And in states across this country now, the Third Act, these are serious players. But they're doing all kinds of other things too. We wanted to, a bunch of young people actually from Fridays for the Future, the kind of local American version of Greta's movement, asked us to help take on the big banks that are Chase City, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the big funders of the fossil fuel industry. And they were like, we want to go after these guys, but we don't even have like checking accounts, so can you help? And we were like, yeah, we can help. And I remember the first demonstration we did was in Boston, and I got there, and there were 200 or 300 high school kids, because high school kids completely understand the thing they're staring down the barrel of, and you know what, they're somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back of the march, there was a bunch of us from this nascent Third Act thing with a big banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels," and we've gone on to bedevil those banks as much as we can. Last year we had one day where we had in 100 cities at the same time demonstrations outside those big banks. We shut down a bunch of them for the day with civil disobedience. We are too old to go sprawl on the sidewalk for 3 or 4 hours at a time. So I was in Washington, and we'd gone to the Goodwill around Washington, and we'd gotten every rocking chair there was to get. And that's what we shut them down with. The New York Times had a big story the next day about the rocking chair rebellion, okay? Now, as we head into this most incredible and consequential election, and I hope you all are paying attention to the fact that for the next 40 days, Michiganders have superpowers, okay? Your superpowers will vanish on November 6th, but until then, you have not to put too much burden on you, but you have many ways the fate of our democracy and the fate of our climate in your hands, so make good use of it. We're doing so at Third Act. We've even got a PAC now, Gray PAC. But we've got, the older people are now, at Third Act are writing 200,000 postcards a week into the swing states, and they're phone banking in huge numbers every night, and they're jumping on buses to go to all, I live in Vermont, so everybody's jumping on the bus and going down to Pennsylvania to knock on doors, because it turns out actually that Americans will still answer the door if there is a 75-year-old lady on the other side, okay? So, it's been really powerful to watch this happening, to watch this intergenerational combination at work. And I think people said this can't work because people become more conservative as they age. I don't know if that was true at one point, but it's not true, I think, anymore. And if you think about it, the reason's clear. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, your first act was in this period of incredible social and cultural and political transformation, when we took women seriously in public life finally, when we saw the apex of the civil rights movement, when we had the first Earth Day with 20 million Americans in the street, 10% of the then population, the biggest demonstrations probably in American history. And within a couple of years, we had the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the EPA and all of that. We won these battles once, and now we have to win them again, and we will. That's the thing. So, I have rattled on much too long here. I'm confident that we will figure out ways to win lots of these things. I'm not completely confident, and I won't lie to you, because at heart I'm a writer and all I really owe you is honesty. I won't lie to you and say that I know we're going to be able to win the climate fight. It's possible that we may have waited too long to get started. My great hero, Dr. King, would end speeches by saying always, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, which I think translates to, this may take a while, but we're going to win. And that was very important comfort for the very brave people of the civil rights movement. But it's not a comfort we have in this case, because the arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win this soon, we don't win it. But that's why we're all in, why we need to be all in, why we need to get as many people as is humanly possible out of their comfort zone and working hard, because our planet is so far outside its comfort zone. That's what it means when we see temperatures like we've never seen before, when we see rainfall like we've never seen before. I don't know that we'll necessarily win, but I am confident by now that we are going to give it a tremendous shot. Confident as you all should be, that as you do the beautiful work represented by all those different booths over there, that you have brothers and sisters in every corner of the world hard at work on the same kind of things and hoping the same kind of things and dreaming the same kind of dreams. And that has a real power. We're in a race. The thing that gives it drama is not knowing exactly how it's going to come out. But the thing that gives it meaning is just racing it, doing it as hard as we possibly can. And that's why I'm just so, so grateful to be with all you good people today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I went on too long, so we have to do some questions.
You mind sharing? I can't believe I get to share a microphone with you now. This is awesome. Thank you so much. Of course, most of the comments are thanking you for your work and how you have inspired them to act over many, many years. So know that these come with a lot of love in them. You were really great mentioning, the next presidential election, and that person will be in office for 4 years. And there are a lot of questions around, why do you think that climate isn't really in those elections? So many people here are really working to get out the climate vote. And if that person, the next person gets elected, that next Congress, there are a lot of questions about policy. What would be the thing that you would like to see them do?
It's a very good question, and this is a sort of torturous election for it's in so many ways. One of the reasons that it's not a big issue, sort of huge voting issue right now, a huge campaigning issue, is partly because the election and our politics for the last decade has been so dominated by this to my mind, repulsive figure of Donald Trump, that he's a kind of black hole that captures all attention and transmutes it into a focus on himself, and so that becomes the thing that, that drives things. The structural reason is that there was no primary this year, because we had an incumbent president, and then, we didn't have a primary. And the primary is the point at which we interject things into the political bloodstream. That's why we got the IRA, was because we organized so hard around the Green New Deal, and during the 2020 primaries, prior to the pandemic, remember they were right before the pandemic, this was the #1 voting issue for Democrats in those primaries. And that's why Joe Biden, in order to sew up the support of the kind of Bernie wing of the party, had to adopt this very, very broad promise around climate. And to his enormous credit, he kept that promise and expended huge amounts of political capital to bring us the IRA. So this time we kind of have to take it on faith at some level. The climate reasons to elect Harris are, one, Donald Trump will do everything possible to derail what's happening. He's made that 100% clear. He announced, among other things, that on day one he would stop wind, which is, reminded me of him drawing with the Sharpie when he wanted the hurricane to go in the other direction. The other reason is because I think that we can have some basic trust that the Harris administration will continue the implementation of the IRA stuff. They'll continue making sure that that money is flowing and that it supports the kind of efforts we're seeing. None of this is perfect. None of this gets done what we need doing as fast as we do, but at least it preserves the kind of framework that we now have for some progress. But I will say, I'm doing literally everything I can think of to get her elected. I'm not going to make it home to Vermont before the election, because it's just one swing state after another, and we're getting the third actors out and going. But once she's in, I also led the organizing for the biggest protests outside the Obama White House during the Obama years, around the Keystone Pipeline. We elect people not because we think they will save us. We elect them because we think they might be susceptible to pressure thereafter, There's no use going and pressuring Donald Trump. He doesn't care. He'd enjoy the chance to lock you up forever, If we elect Harris, then we have a real chance to do things. And I will say, I was in New York the last couple of days, my one blue state visit, because it's Climate Week in New York, and I saw a guy at the White House that I know there who was there giving a talk, and I said, I hope you're taking note of the fact that we are cutting you an ungodly amount of slack during this election, not pressing you constantly on stuff. And I hope that you understand what that is. The message was received anyway. The final structural reason here is a reminder of how dumb the architecture of our electoral system is at this point. For the same reason that the United States has wasted hundreds of billions of dollars at this point on the dumbest technology there ever was, ethanol, entirely because the Iowa caucuses were the first. We're not talking about climate change because Pennsylvania, for some reason, has been granted the privilege of deciding who the next president will be, and they're terrified that if they talk about fracking, it'll lose them Pennsylvania. I think they're probably wrong about that, but I understand their caution. So.
Thanks for that answer. So there were a lot of questions about how we relate to the multiple existential crises that we seem to be facing in this broad moment. And also how we connect to the other organizations and movements. So I'm taking my liberty here as moderator and putting your amazing 40 questions over there into some broad themes, folks. But I think the big thing that we all understand, the movement is intersectional. And I'm so proud of you all today. There's health, justice, voters, democracy, biodiversity are all here today. So I think the big question is, how do we build power amongst all those organizations? How do you see that?
So I think that really is the big question. And I think that there's rarely a kind of big enough answer for it. Like, there's not a thing that we could do that would deliver all the justice that we need in one fell swoop. I mean, we talk. People will say we should get rid of capitalism, or that might work, or whatever. But it doesn't. I don't even really ever quite understand what that means exactly. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in this transition to renewable energy is that it seems to me that, aside from being absolutely necessary for physical reasons, it's subversive in all kinds of interesting ways that help in, and one of them is that as long as we depend on the power from fossil fuel, the people who live on top of the rare deposits of coal and gas and oil end up with way too much power. In the case of this country, our biggest oil and gas barons are the Koch brothers. They control more refining and pipeline capacity and things than anybody else. And they took their winnings and they used it to destroy our democracy. Long before Donald Trump came on the scene, we were in big trouble because of what they had done. And it's been around every issue of race and of public education and public health and on and on and on. In the larger world, the same thing. The biggest oil and gas baron in Europe is Vladimir Putin, and he's used his winnings to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. So it's very nice to imagine depriving those guys of some of their power and instead delivering it to more local places. This isn't going to happen perfectly and automatically, and there's still people who are going to get rich in solar panels and whatever, but the trend is very much in the direction of a more localized world than the one that we live in now. A world where, among other things, community control of energy and stuff starts setting a model for things. I was very grateful to see the Ann Arbor for Public Power initiative out there. In part because it's very necessary in order to get renewables going at the pace that we need. Big utilities don't like them because they like doing things the way they've always done them, But in part because it's a reminder that community, look, I guess the closest I can come to answering that question of how do we solve everything at once is to say, I think that the deepest American problem, it's always been a character trait of Americans, but I think it became a kind of malign character trait sometime around the Reagan administration, is what's now become a sort of hyper-individualism, a inability. I mean, we live in a country where 3/4 of people don't know their next door neighbor. They may know their name, but they have no relationship with them. And that's such a strange deviation from human history, from who we have always been as a species, that it's no wonder that we're kind of go crazy in all kinds of ways. One of the beautiful ways back into a world that works is towards more stronger community control of all kinds of things. And energy may be the sort of gateway in there because it's the absolute easiest of all these things to do. We've been given a piece of magic. The fact that the cheapest way to produce power in the world, and power along with food are the two most important commodities we have, once you have water, which in Michigan is not always to be taken for granted. The fact that we now have that incredibly cheap, that is Hogwarts scale magic, okay? That is such a powerful idea that it can start rewriting the rules of the world on which we live. So even if we didn't need to do it to save our necks, it would be a damn good idea to do it anyway. And the fact that we do need to do it to save our necks should make it happen in the next few years if we all do everything that we can, which is a lot to ask. And it is in a sense, and here I really will end, it is in a sense a burden to be alive and knowledgeable at this moment, because there's a lot of pain and it feels like a lot of pressure. But it's also an extraordinary privilege to get to be in this. I mean, look, most people in the course of their lives really are never able to say, I'm doing the most important thing I could possibly be doing at this moment. But everybody in this room, all the things that you can all say that. And we're all going to be alive in 5 years to see how this story kind of comes out. So that's the marching orders. We just got to dig down and do what we can and trust in each other and see where we get. So thank you all enormously.
You got music, right?
Couldn't say anything better after that. I hope you all stick around for our reception for Nikki Love Rhodes and our performance here. And the only other thing that I mentioned this morning, today you met and new ones and old friends of the climate champions that are out there. MyCan's awards are now open for nominations this year. The theme is climate civics. I know you saw people doing this work today. Please nominate them for an award and stick around. Let's thank my team. There are 4 of us that put this on, you guys. Thank these volunteers. Thank the planning committee. U of MCs for hosting us, all of you for coming out today and spending a wonderful summit with us. We'll see you next year. I don't know what I'm doing yet. Thank you.